Hi, Nines. So today we are going to learn about a synapse, so more in depth on how a message is passed on between neurons. So last lesson we learnt about the structure of a neuron here. So we looked at the different structures. This is one neuron. So remember what a neuron does is an electrical message is passed on from one neuron to another. It detects it first. So if you remember, like it detects heat, for example, the receptor will detect the heat and then will send a message via the neuron to the brain. So if you guys remember, I used the example of Chinese whispers. So there are neurons lined up with each other, one after the other. It's like if our class was to line up and the message was passed along. So as I said, it's an electrical message that passes within a neuron. But there's also chemical messages involved as well. So if we just look at, so obviously there's three neurons here. I know it looks a bit weird, but there's one neuron here, another, and another here. So what happens is the receptors send the message to the neuron. An electrical message is, oh, let me just, give me one sec, guys. So there's an electrical message going along here, and then it connects to the next neuron, electrical message, next neuron, and electrical message until it reaches the brain. So what we're going to do is between those neurons, these neurons aren't actually glued together. So if, like for example, if our class was lining up, there's obviously a gap between me and let's say Sam. There's obviously a gap between us, right? So within that gap, a chemical is released. So that's what we're going to look at more in depth. So this is about communication between neurons. This is page 14. I've skipped this one for particular reason. We're coming back to that. So if we look at this as a two neurons, the electrical message, or a thing called action potential, goes on a neuron, then it's going to connect to the neuron. As you see here, there's a gap, and this gap is known as a synapse. And within that gap, a lot of things happen that's really important. So a synapse is a small gap between two neurons. When the nerve impulse reaches the terminal, so remember how I said these are the axon terminal, remember the flights are taking off? When it reaches there, it's no longer an electrical message because there's a gap. So that electrical message can't pass on between the gaps. So what happens is this chemical called neurotransmitter is released into this space or this gap. And then the other neuron will collect those chemicals, receive the chemicals, and then the electrical message will continue. So between those gaps, there's a chemical called neurotransmitter that is released. The chemical is secreted from the presynaptic neuron, which then affects the activity of the postsynaptic. So if you guys remember, like if you do a pre-test means a test before the actual test. So pre means before, and if you do a post-test, that means post means after. So it starts off with the presynaptic. The chemical is released from this cell to the next, which is the postsynaptic synaptic, and the electrical message continues there. So all you need to know so far is there's a gap between the neurons called a synapse. The electrical message moves within the neuron. As soon as it reaches that gap, the synapse, a chemical is released called a neurotransmitter, um, and the other cell collects it and passes on to the next. Okay, so I'm going to draw. I'm going to draw. So I would suggest getting a blank piece of paper or back of your booklet or somewhere, draw this as well. So what I'm doing here, so as you guys can see in the corner here, this is two neurons and it looks awful. What I'm going to do is I'm going to get a magnifying glass. I'm going to see the part that's highlighted. I'm going to zoom up on it. And this is what I have here. So I've zoomed up on it. This is one axon terminal and this is the other neuron. So this is the postsynaptic neuron. So this is the postsynaptic. And obviously this is the presynaptic because pre means before. So what's happening here is the electrical message comes and now it's reached the end. When it comes to the end, there are these little bags here, or they're also known as vesicles. These bags are here and they hold these chemicals known as neurotransmitters. So the blue is the neurotransmitters. Oh, I spelled that wrong. Transmitters. And these bag-like things are called vesicles. So right now, these bags holding these neurotransmitters are kicking back at the axon terminal. As soon as the electrical message comes, it's going to push these vesicles, it's going to push those bags towards the end, right? Because we need to release it. We need to release what's in those bags. So what's going to happen is the bag, this is going to get pushed to the edge. And as it's getting pushed, everything, all the neurotransmitters on the inside is going to get released into the gap. And we know this gap is called the synapse. So the electrical message comes, it pushes these bags towards the end, and it's releasing all these neurotransmitters. So now you've got all these chemicals floating in this gap, but these chemicals need to reach the other neuron because the message needs to be passed on, right? So this other neuron, this postsynaptic neuron, has these, let's say, little doors, right? And these are called receptors. So if you remember, these receptors are things that detect stimulus. So what's going to happen is these neurotransmitters, it's going to bind to these receptors here. So I'm going to label these receptors, and the neurotransmitters are going to bind to the receptors. As soon as it binds to it, it's like, okay, we've got a neurotransmitter, we've got the message. Now what we're going to do is we're going to stimulate an electrical message, and it's going to pass it along. So the electrical message is coming along here. It's reached the gap. It's reached the axon terminal. What it does is it's going to push the vesicles holding the neurotransmitters into the synapse, so into the gap. Then you've got neurotransmitters just floating around. It needs to go to the postsynaptic neuron, the next neuron. Then what it does is the receptors, as it's floating around, it's going to bind to these receptors on the next neuron. And as soon as it locks in, it can be like, yep, we've got the message. We're going to continue to pass the electrical message. So that's what's happening. Between neurons, it's chemical. These are chemicals. And within the neuron, it's electrical. So that's really important. If we go back to our slides, this is just a summary of what I kind of said. So neurotransmitter is the definition is a chemical message that transmits signals from a neuron to a target across a synapse. So it doesn't have to be a neuron in particular. It can also be a muscle or a gland. So for example, once the message has to come, let's say my hand is on a hot plate, it needs to tell the muscles in my hand to move. So the target the last neuron, obviously there's neurons along here, the last neuron would have to tell the message to the muscle, be like, hey, you need to contract or you need to relax. They are packaged in synaptic vesicles, so vesicles are the bags, in the presynaptic neuron. So this is just a fact. So what happens is when you take certain drugs, it can stop or block the release of those chemicals. So what happens is those neurotransmitters aren't released, or it's released and it's not caught by those receptors. This is how things kind of slowing down the brain function. This is another diagram, pretty much what I drew, so you can have a look at that. Honestly, just pause for a second, have a look at this diagram, see if you understand it, annotate it, and if you have any questions, jot them down on the side, that way I can answer in the next session. So like I said, the impulse comes down the axon, it causes the vesicles containing the neurotransmitters to move down, it's going to be pushed across into the synapse. The neurotransmitters attach to those receptors in the postsynaptic neuron, and the impulse will continue. So obviously, if I have my hand on a hot plate and the messages come, yep, I'm going to raise it up, I'm not going to continue to do this, right? So eventually I'm going to have to stop. Once I've moved it, that's it. So what's going to happen is those neurotransmitters, because if we go back to that picture, what's going to happen is if these neurotransmitters keep attaching to the receptors, the message is going to be passed on. So eventually, what's going to happen is, just eraser, these neurotransmitters will slowly disappear, so they can be broken down by enzymes, or they can be taken back up. They can be taken back by the cell and then put into those bags again until the next message comes. Okay, so that's it, guys. So this is how the synapse works. I'm also going to attach a YouTube video. It's another 2-minute YouTube video. There's an animation. Please watch that after this, just to validate your understanding. And if you have any questions, please let me know.